What if the most famous act of defiance in American history was never spontaneous at all? Picture a December evening in Montgomery, Alabama, 1955. A 42-year-old seamstress boards a Cleveland Avenue bus after a long day's work at the Montgomery Fair department store. Her shoulders ache from hours bent over fabric and thread. Her feet are swollen from standing on concrete floors all day. The December air carries the smell of diesel exhaust and dried leaves as the bus lurches forward into the gathering dusk. She takes her seat in the first row of the colored section, that invisible line drawn across the bus between those who mattered and those who did not. Emotion value tense, she watches the white section fill, passenger by passenger. A white man boards and has no place to sit. Emotion value tense / the driver turns around. His name is James Blake, and 12 years earlier, he had forced Rosa Parks off his bus for boarding through the front door instead of the back. She remembers that humiliation, the way he had screamed at her in front of all those passengers. Now he tells her and 3 other black passengers to give up their row so that one white man can sit alone. The fluorescent lights hum overhead. The engine idles. The other passengers grow quiet. 3 passengers stand. Rosa Parks does not. The story most Americans know ends there. Wrapped in a comfortable myth, Rosa Parks was tired. Rosa Parks acted on impulse. Rosa Parks was just an ordinary woman who had finally had enough. Teachers across America tell students that she simply could not bear to stand one more time, that exhaustion overcame her, that in a moment of human frailty transformed into moral courage, she remained seated. The narrative is comforting in its simplicity. One tired woman, one brave refusal, one spark that ignited a movement. But here is the truth they rarely tell you. Rosa Parks had been preparing for that moment for 12 years. That tired seamstress was one of the most strategically trained civil rights investigators in the American South. Her refusal was not an act of exhaustion. It was an act of calculated, precise, revolutionary defiance, backed by networks of organizers who had been building the infrastructure for this moment since before World War II ended. Her stillness on that bus seat was the culmination of thousands of hours of planning, training, organizing, and waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Every breath she took while sitting there was deliberate. Every second she remained seated was a choice. Think about that for a moment. What changes when you realize the Montgomery Bus Boycott was not a spark of spontaneous courage, but the culmination of decades of patient, dangerous, invisible work? Everything changes. In December of 1943, a young Rosa Parks walked into the Montgomery chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and became its secretary. The office was small, cramped, filled with filing cabinets stuffed with documents that would be dangerous if discovered. She was 30 years old, married to a barber named Raymond Parks, and she was not joining a social club. She was enlisting in a covert war against American apartheid, one that required her to document horrors most people could not imagine, and to keep those horrors secret from the white power structure that would destroy anyone who challenged it. Emotion value tense / her husband Raymond had been a longtime WDAP member. He understood what that membership meant in 1930s Alabama, where organizing for civil rights could get you killed. The organization met in secret, often in different locations each week to avoid surveillance by police and white supremacist groups. Its members rarely discussed their work outside trusted circles. Merely possessing NWC membership materials could mark you as a target for violence from the Ku Klux Klan or any number of vigilante groups who saw themselves as defenders of the Southern way of life. Raymond had spent years working on the Scottsboro Boys case. one of the most notorious racial injustice cases of the era. 9 black teenagers had been falsely accused of assaulting 2 white women on a train, and 8 of them had been sentenced to death by all-white juries in trials that lasted barely more than a day. The courtrooms had been packed with hostile white spectators. The defense attorneys had been given no time to prepare. The verdicts had been predetermined before the gavels fell. Raymond knew what happened to people who challenged the Southern system. He had seen colleagues lose their jobs, their homes, their lives. He had attended secret meetings in the dead of night, whispering about strategy while keeping one eye on the door. Rosa learned quickly. She learned that change required not just courage but meticulous record-keeping. She learned that the fight against segregation was also a fight against silence, that documenting injustice was itself a form of resistance. She learned to move quietly through a world designed to crush anyone who spoke too loudly, to blend in while gathering information that could bring down systems of oppression. Within 2 years of joining the Montgomery NAACP, she was assigned her first major investigation. In 1945, Parks traveled to Abbeville, Alabama, to investigate the gang rape of a young black woman named Recy Taylor. The facts of the case were straightforward and horrifying. 6 white men had kidnapped Taylor at gunpoint as she walked home from church on a Sunday evening, driven her to a remote location, assaulted her repeatedly, and left her on the side of a rural road with a warning that they would kill her if she told anyone. The dirt road where they abandoned her stretched into darkness in both directions. Taylor had walked home alone, her dress torn, her body broken, carrying a secret that could get her killed if she spoke. Taylor told anyway. She reported the assault to the sheriff. Can you guess what happened next? Local authorities refused to press charges. The grand jury refused to indict. The 6 men walked free, their names protected, their lives undisturbed. They continued living in Abbeville, walking past Taylor on the street, watching her work in the fields, reminding her through their presence that they had taken what they wanted and faced no consequences. This was 1945 Alabama, where a black woman's body was considered the property of any white man who wanted it, where reporting assault was itself an act of dangerous defiance that could bring further violence. Emotion value Rosa Parks traveled to Abbeville to document what had happened. Can you imagine what it took to investigate that case? A black woman traveling alone through rural Alabama, interviewing witnesses who were terrified to speak, documenting evidence that no court would ever consider, knowing that the same men who had attacked Taylor would face no consequences and might target anyone who spoke against them. The roads were unpaved, dusty in summer and muddy in winter. The houses where witnesses lived were shacks without electricity or running water. Parks knocked on doors. She asked questions. She wrote down names and dates and details in notebooks that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Parks did it anyway. She assembled testimonies with the precision of a lawyer and the courage of a soldier. She wrote reports that were forwarded to NAACP headquarters in New York, documenting patterns of violence that newspapers refused to cover. She built a case that the NAACP used to launch a national campaign demanding justice for Recy Taylor, generating newspaper coverage across the country and letters to Alabama's governor demanding action. The campaign brought attention that the state of Alabama desperately wanted to avoid. The campaign failed to secure convictions. Those 6 white men were never punished. They lived out their lives in freedom while Recy Taylor carried her trauma to the grave. But the campaign accomplished something else. It trained Rosa Parks in the brutal realities of Southern justice and the meticulous work required to challenge it. It taught her that resistance required patience, documentation, strategy. It taught her that sometimes you fought battles you knew you could not win because the fight itself built the capacity for future victories. This was not the work of a woman who would one day act on tired impulse. This was the training of a revolutionary. Meanwhile, other organizers were building parallel infrastructure throughout Montgomery's Black community. In 1946, a year after Parks investigated the Taylor case, a group of Black professional women in Montgomery founded the Women's Political Council. These were teachers, nurses, social workers, college professors, women with educations and influence who had grown tired of the daily humiliations Black residents faced on city buses. They met in living rooms and church basements, their voices low, their determination fierce. The buses of Montgomery were theaters of degradation. Black passengers paid at the front, then had to exit and reboard through the rear door, sometimes watching the bus drive away while they walked toward the back. Black passengers had to stand over empty seats in the white section, their bodies swaying with every turn while white passengers sat comfortably in seats that remained empty because no Black person could claim them. Black passengers were routinely cursed, insulted, sometimes physically assaulted by drivers who faced no consequences. The smell of diesel and sweat filled the buses. The humiliation was daily, routine, inescapable. Jo Ann Robinson, an English professor at Alabama State College, became the council's president after her own devastating experience with the bus system. Newly arrived in Montgomery, she had boarded a bus and sat in one of the front seats without realizing she had crossed the invisible color line. The driver screamed at her so viciously that she fled the bus in tears, humiliated in front of a crowd of passengers who watched in silence. That incident transformed her. She would never again accept the system that had made her feel subhuman. She channeled her humiliation into organizing. For nearly a decade, the Women's Political Council documented abuses, filed complaints with city officials, and built a network of communication that could reach nearly every Black home in Montgomery within hours. They met in churches and living rooms, sometimes late at night to avoid detection. They recruited members from every Black women's organization in the city. They established phone trees and distribution chains and identified leaders in every neighborhood who could spread information like wildfire. The infrastructure grew quietly, invisibly, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. How many people know about the Women's Political Council today? Almost none. Yet, without their patient organizing, without the years they spent building communication networks while the white power structure ignored them, the bus boycott could never have succeeded. The infrastructure was invisible, but it was everything. By 1954, Robinson and the council had formally demanded changes to Montgomery's bus system. They sent letters to the mayor on official letterhead. They met with city commissioners in their offices. They presented detailed proposals for more humane treatment of Black passengers, not even demanding an end to segregation, just basic dignity. They asked for fixed color lines on buses so drivers could not humiliate passengers by moving them arbitrarily. They asked for courteous treatment. They asked to be treated as human beings. City officials ignored them. But Robinson did not retreat. Instead, she began planning for something bigger. She mapped out Black neighborhoods, identifying which churches served which areas. She compiled lists of community leaders, social club presidents, teachers who could spread information through their schools. She established communication chains that could activate within hours. And she drafted contingency plans, including a detailed leaflet announcing a bus boycott, ready to be printed and distributed the moment the right opportunity arose. Emotion value 10/Sal they needed was the right case, the right defendant, the right spark. In March of 1955, 9 months before Rosa Parks made history, a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin was arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat in Montgomery. Claudette was brilliant. brave, and defiant. She had been studying Black history in school, learning for the first time about Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad, about Sojourner Truth's demand to be recognized as a woman, about the long tradition of Black resistance to white supremacy. Those lessons burned in her mind as she sat on the Cleveland Avenue bus and watched the driver order her to move. The afternoon sun slanted through the dirty windows. The bus was crowded with passengers returning from work and school. She refused. "It's my constitutional right to sit here as much as that lady," she told the officers who dragged her off the bus. "I paid my fare. It's my constitutional right." Her voice rang through the bus as they pulled her toward the door. Emotion value tense. They handcuffed her. They threw her in jail. They charged her with disorderly conduct and assault and violating the city's segregation ordinance. She was 15 years old. The NAACP attorneys met to discuss her case. Here was exactly what they had been waiting for: a clear violation of a Black passenger's rights, an articulate defendant who could explain exactly why she had resisted, an opportunity to challenge bus segregation in federal court on constitutional grounds. The room buzzed with possibility. But community leaders hesitated. Emotion value tense. Claudette was 15 years old. She came from a poor family, living in a small house in King Hill, one of Montgomery's rougher neighborhoods. And within weeks of her arrest, community leaders learned something that, in their calculation, disqualified her from becoming the face of the movement. Claudette Colvin was pregnant. The men who would decide whether to make her the test case looked at Claudette Colvin and asked a devastating question. Would white America care about this girl? Would her youth and poverty and pregnancy allow segregationists to dismiss the case, to attack her character, to change the subject from constitutional rights to moral failings? Would newspapers that might cover the case focus on her pregnancy instead of her courage? They decided she was too controversial, too young, too pregnant, too poor. The movement could not afford to build its test case around someone who could be attacked by segregationists as morally compromised. The decision was made behind closed doors, and Claudette Colvin's name faded from the conversation. This was not cowardice. It was strategy. And it reveals something crucial about how change actually happens, not through random acts of courage, but through calculated decisions about how to deploy courage for maximum effect. Every piece on the board matters. Every choice shapes what becomes possible. Think about how cold that calculus must have felt. A 15-year-old girl had risked everything to resist injustice, and the movement she hoped to spark had decided she was not respectable enough to be its symbol. Claudette Colvin would eventually become one of the plaintiffs in Browder v. Gale, the case that actually ended bus segregation in Montgomery. But she would not be its face. She would not become a household name. Her courage would be used strategically rather than celebrated publicly. She would live the rest of her life in relative obscurity while Rosa Parks became an icon. E.D. Nixon, the president of Montgomery's NAACP chapter, had been waiting years for the right case. A veteran organizer who had helped found the Alabama State NAACP. Nixon worked as a Pullman porter on the railroad, traveling across the country while building networks of civil rights activists in every city his train passed through. The rhythmic clatter of train wheels had accompanied countless conversations about strategy and resistance. He understood that challenging segregation required more than righteous anger. It required a plaintiff who was, in his words, above reproach. Someone whose character could not be questioned. Someone whose background could withstand the most hostile investigation. Someone whose story would force even racist white Americans to confront the brutality of the system. Rosa Parks was that person. She was a married woman with a stable job. She was active in her church. She had no criminal record, no scandals, no vulnerabilities that segregationists could exploit. She was educated, articulate, dignified. She was, in the language of the era, respectable. She was also, as it happened, one of the most experienced civil rights organizers in the city. And that summer, she became even more prepared. Parks attended the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, a training center for labor and civil rights organizers that had been operating since 1932 in the mountains above Knoxville. For 2 weeks in July and August of 1955, she studied tactics of nonviolent resistance with activists from across the South. The school sat on a hillside surrounded by forest, far from the surveillance of Southern police departments. She learned about the sit-down strikes that had won victories for labor unions in the 1930s. She discussed strategies for challenging segregation in different contexts. She role-played scenarios of confrontation and arrest, practicing how to remain calm while being cursed, how to go limp when being dragged, how to maintain dignity in the face of degradation. Septima Clark, the legendary educator who directed workshops at Highlander, later remembered Parks as quiet but intensely focused, absorbing everything, asking sharp questions about tactics and consequences. Parks returned to Montgomery with something more than anger. She returned with training. When Rosa Parks sat down on that Cleveland Avenue bus on December 1st, 1955, she had just spent months absorbing lessons in strategic resistance from some of the most experienced organizers in America. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew that refusing to stand would likely result in her arrest. She knew that her arrest could trigger the mass action that organizers had been preparing for nearly a decade. She knew that her personal sacrifice might finally break the system that had humiliated her and millions of others for their entire lives. And she was not alone. Within hours of Parks's arrest, the networks activated. E.D. Nixon received a call informing him that Rosa had been taken to jail. He knew immediately that this was the moment they had been waiting for. Here was a plaintiff who was above reproach, arrested on a clear-cut case, in the same city where the Women's Political Council had been building protest infrastructure for years. The phone lines buzzed across Montgomery. Emotion value tense, Nixon bailed Parks out of jail that evening and immediately called Jo Ann Robinson. By midnight, Robinson and 2 of her students were at Alabama State College, working through the night to mimeograph leaflets that would announce a 1-day bus boycott on December 5th, the day of Parks's trial. The mimeograph machine whirred and clanked as they fed paper through, the smell of ink filling the room. They worked by the light of desk lamps, careful not to draw attention. 50,000 leaflets. Think about that number for a moment. In an era before email, before social media, before instant communication of any kind, a handful of organizers produced 50,000 leaflets in a single night and distributed them to every black neighborhood in Montgomery by morning. They used the Women's Political Council's distribution network, the one Robinson had spent nearly a decade building. They activated church networks and teachers' associations and social clubs. They deputized children to run leaflets door to door. By dawn, the streets of Montgomery were filled with the rustle of paper as black residents woke to find the call to boycott on their doorsteps. This was not improvisation. This was infrastructure, tested and ready, waiting to be deployed. The leaflets were simple and direct. Don't ride the bus to work, to town, to school, or any place Monday, December 5th. They explained that a woman had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat, that this was the second such arrest in recent months, that black citizens had suffered these indignities long enough. They called for a meeting that evening at the Holt Street Baptist Church to decide whether to continue the protest. On December 5th, 1955. 90% of Black Montgomery stayed off the buses. 90%. On the first day. With almost no warning. Picture the buses rolling through Montgomery that morning. Nearly empty except for their white passengers. The seats that normally overflowed with Black workers heading to their jobs sat vacant, their green vinyl catching the morning light. Picture the sidewalks crowded with Black workers walking to their jobs, some of them walking miles each way, choosing sore feet over humiliation. Picture the white business owners watching their workforce arrive late, watching their customers fail to appear, realizing suddenly that the people they had taken for granted possessed a power that could not be ignored. That extraordinary participation rate was not spontaneous. It was the direct result of the communication networks that Robinson, Nixon, Parks, and dozens of other organizers had spent years building. Every church received the leaflet, every teachers' association, every social club, every neighborhood leader who had been identified and cultivated by the Women's Political Council. The invisible infrastructure became visible in its effects. When the boycott's success became clear, the organizers met that evening at Holt Street Baptist Church to decide their next steps. The church was packed beyond capacity, with thousands standing outside listening to speakers through windows propped open against the December chill. They formed the Montgomery Improvement Association and needed a president, someone who could speak for the movement, handle the media attention that would come, and withstand the inevitable attacks from segregationists. They chose a 26-year-old minister who had been in Montgomery for barely a year. His name was Martin Luther King Jr. Why King? Rosa Parks later explained with characteristic strategic clarity. He hadn't been there long enough to make any strong friends or enemies. A newcomer would not carry the baggage of old conflicts, the accumulated resentments that might divide the community. He was educated, articulate, young enough to bring energy but old enough to command respect. He had a way with words that could translate the movement's grievances into language that resonated beyond Montgomery. And because he was new, he had not yet acquired the enemies that longer-tenured leaders had accumulated through years of challenging the white power structure. Even the selection of their spokesman was strategic. Every decision was strategic. What followed was 381 days of sustained, organized resistance. A boycott that required 40,000 people to find alternative transportation every single day for more than a year. 381 days of walking to work in the summer heat and the winter cold. 381 days of carpools and coordination and constant police harassment. 381 days of refusing to surrender. The organizers built a private taxi system using church station wagons and volunteer drivers. Black-owned taxi companies agreed to carry passengers at bus fare rates until the city ordered them to charge minimum fare or lose their licenses. White employers, suddenly unable to find domestic workers willing to take the bus, began driving their maids and cooks to work themselves, inadvertently supporting the boycott they opposed. The organizers established more than 40 pickup stations across the city where workers could find rides to their jobs. They arranged carpools and coordinated schedules with the precision of a military operation. The logistics required hundreds of volunteers working around the clock. And when the city tried to shut down the carpool system by claiming it was an unlicensed municipal transportation operation, the boycott simply continued on foot. Thousands of people walked. As King later reflected, we came to see that in the long run it is more honorable to walk in dignity than ride in humiliation. So we decided to substitute tired feet for tired souls. Those tired feet belonged to nameless cooks and maids who walked endless miles to work and back, day after day, month after month, through rain and cold and blistering heat. They belonged to elderly grandmothers who had been riding buses for 40 years, their joints aching with every step. They belonged to pregnant mothers carrying children and groceries through streets where white drivers sometimes swerved close to frighten them. They belonged to teenagers walking to school past buses that rolled by empty, their footsteps a quiet protest against injustice. They belonged to janitors and teachers and nurses and factory workers, each of them making a daily choice to suffer inconvenience for dignity. One elderly woman became legendary during the boycott for her response when someone offered her a ride. "My feet is tired," she said, "but my soul is rested." But here is what the mythology misses. Those individual choices were supported by collective infrastructure. The carpools that organized rides, the churches that raised money for gas and vehicle repairs, the lawyers who defended boycott participants when police arrested them on trumped-up charges, the out-of-state donors who sent money to keep the movement alive, the phone trees that spread information about mass meetings, the committees that coordinated logistics and strategy. Every act of individual courage was embedded in a web of collective support. Rosa Parks herself served as a dispatcher for the carpool system, sitting at a desk with maps and schedules, coordinating rides and tracking routes, making sure that workers could get to their jobs and protesters could get to meetings. The famous icon of resistance spent her days doing logistics, the unglamorous work that actually made sustained protest possible. She answered phones. She maintained records. She solved problems when drivers failed to show up or vehicles broke down. This is what revolution actually looks like. Not a single dramatic moment, but thousands of hours of coordination and commitment. In February of 1956, the city struck back. King's home was bombed while his wife Coretta and baby daughter Yolanda were inside. The explosion blew out the windows and shattered the front porch. They survived. But the message was clear. Challenge us and we will destroy you. E.D. Nixon's home was bombed the same night. City officials indicted over 80 boycott leaders on charges of conspiring to conduct an illegal boycott. King was convicted and ordered to pay $500 or serve 386 days in jail. The violence and legal persecution did not break the movement. It strengthened it. The bombings generated national media coverage that exposed the brutality of segregation to audiences who had never thought much about conditions in the South. The mass indictments made martyrs of the boycott's leaders and demonstrated that challenging segregation required more than individual courage. It required collective solidarity. The boycott ended in December of 1956, 381 days after it began, when the Supreme Court affirmed a lower court ruling that Alabama's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional. The case that won, Browder v. Gale, did not even feature Rosa Parks as a plaintiff. The NAACP attorneys had strategically assembled a different group of plaintiffs: Aurelia Browder, Susie McDonald, Claudette Colvin, and Mary Louise Smith, calculating that a class of plaintiffs would make for a stronger constitutional challenge than a single defendant. Even the legal victory was strategic. The lawyers chose plaintiffs. They crafted arguments. They built on precedents from Brown v. Board of Education 2 years earlier. Nothing was left to chance. But here is the part of the story that rarely gets told. Rosa Parks paid a terrible price for her calculated act of resistance. She and her husband both lost their jobs in the months after her arrest. The department store where she worked as a seamstress fired her. Raymond lost his position as a barber. They received constant death threats, phone calls at all hours promising violence. Their names appeared on lists circulated by white supremacist groups throughout the South. In 1957, unable to find work in Montgomery, Parks and her husband moved to Detroit. The woman who had become a global symbol of courage spent years struggling to find employment. Her health declining from stress and overwork, and the accumulated trauma of fighting a system designed to destroy her. She would eventually receive recognition, medals, honors, a place in history books, the Congressional Gold Medal. But the immediate aftermath of her resistance was not triumph. It was exile. This too is part of the real story. Strategic organizing does not eliminate sacrifice. It does not make resistance safe. It simply makes resistance effective. Rosa Parks knew when she refused to stand that she might lose everything. She refused anyway, because she was part of a movement that gave her sacrifice meaning. What lessons does Montgomery hold for us today? Consider how many times you have heard about a movement that seemed to appear from nowhere. The protests that erupted overnight. The hashtag that went viral. The uprising that surprised everyone. Now ask yourself, what if none of them were really spontaneous? The Occupy Wall Street movement that appeared to spring up overnight in 2011 emerged from years of anarchist organizing and careful planning by activists at Adbusters magazine, who had spent a decade building networks and testing tactics. The marriage equality victory at the Supreme Court in 2015 followed decades of patient litigation by Lambda Legal and other organizations, building precedent through hundreds of cases while simultaneously running public education campaigns that shifted American opinion over a generation. The Me Too movement's explosion in 2017 built on a phrase that activist Tarana Burke had coined in 2006 to support survivors of sexual violence, and on organizing networks that activist women had quietly constructed for years before a hashtag made their work visible. Every sudden breakthrough stands on invisible infrastructure. Ella Baker, who helped found both the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, understood this better than anyone. Baker had spent over 50 years in civil rights organizing by the time she died, rarely seeking the spotlight, always building capacity. She had worked as the NAACP's editor of branches in the 1940s, the organization's highest-ranking woman, traveling across the country to establish new chapters and train local leaders. Strong people don't need strong leaders, Baker taught. They need strong organizations. They need networks. They need patient institution building that can survive any individual's arrest or assassination or exhaustion. She trained the young activists who would lead sit-ins and freedom rides. She persuaded Martin Luther King Jr. to fund the founding conference of SNCC. She insisted that the student movement remain independent rather than becoming absorbed into older organizations, because she understood that different tactics required different structures. Why did Baker resist the charismatic leadership model that King represented? Because she understood that sustainable change requires distributed power. A movement that depends on a single charismatic leader can be decapitated with a single bullet. A movement built on thousands of trained organizers, connected by robust networks, sharing strategies and resources, can survive anything. Consider how prophetic that analysis proved to be. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, the organizations he had helped build continued their work. The movement did not die with him because it was never solely dependent on him. The infrastructure survived. Rosa Parks was not tired. She was trained. She was prepared. She was connected to networks of organizers who had been building capacity for years. She was part of a strategic movement that had spent 12 years waiting for the right moment to strike. And when she sat down on that bus, she triggered a cascade of organized action that had been decades in the making. The myth of spontaneous resistance is comforting. It suggests that change happens when ordinary people simply cannot take injustice anymore. That courage alone is enough to move mountains. That if you feel strongly enough, somehow the universe will provide the means to act. But courage without strategy is martyrdom. And martyrdom however noble, does not win campaigns. What wins is what Montgomery demonstrated: patient organizing that builds networks before the crisis comes, strategic timing that waits for the right case rather than rushing into action, careful selection of both plaintiffs and leaders based on strategic criteria rather than just enthusiasm, robust infrastructure that can sustain action over months and years, communication systems that move faster than authorities can respond, legal strategies that build on precedent toward constitutional victory. The bus boycott succeeded not because one woman was brave. Hundreds of women had been brave before Rosa Parks, including Claudette Colvin just 9 months earlier. Thousands of Black women had resisted bus segregation in thousands of small acts that never made the news, were never documented, never became the spark for mass action. It succeeded because that particular woman's bravery was embedded in a system designed to amplify it. When we reduce the Montgomery bus boycott to a single moment of individual courage, we miss its most revolutionary lesson. Sustainable change is not about heroic individuals. It is about the invisible labor of building organizations that can turn individual courage into collective power. Joanne Robinson distributing 50,000 leaflets through networks she spent years constructing. E.D. Nixon waiting for the right plaintiff to build his legal challenge. Passing over Claudette Colvin because the strategic moment demanded a different face. The Women's Political Council pressing for reforms since 1946. Building infrastructure for nearly a decade before they had occasion to use it. Rosa Parks investigating sexual assault cases in rural Alabama. Attending workshops at Highlander Folk School. Learning how to turn rage into strategic action. All of it invisible. All of it essential. All of it strategy. So the next time you see a movement that appears to burst onto the scene from nowhere, ask yourself, what infrastructure made this possible? What years of patient organizing built the networks that let this moment happen? Whose names will never appear in the history books even though nothing would have been possible without them? Those are the real revolutionaries, not the ones who appear on the evening news. Ones who built the machinery that made the evening news possible. Rosa Parks knew this. That is why, even as she became one of the most famous women in America, she spent her days coordinating carpools, answering phones, solving logistical problems. The famous face of the movement did invisible work because she understood that invisible work was what actually won. The myth says she was tired. The truth is she was ready. And behind her stood an army of organizers who had been getting ready for decades. The work is never glamorous. The work is never finished. But the work, ultimately, is what wins.